is a big one, this. It's a hot debate. According to the Fire Brigades Union, firefighters earning approximately £32,000 a year have been turning to food banks over the past few months. This comes after the union rejected a 5% pay offer from the government in which they branded it disgusting. Well, Tory MP Brendan Clark-Smith commented on this tweet, saying, "I respect the profession, but £32,244 and using a food bank? Never heard such a ridiculous thing in my life." Well, with me to discuss this and debate it, I am very pleased to say, is the man himself, MP Brendan Clark-Smith, and fireman and trade unionist Paul Embry. Sparks will fly, people. Sparks will fly. Brendan, why did you say what you said? People might say you're a bit out of touch. Do you really think that 32 and a bit grand you shouldn't be using a food bank?
Well, I think a lot of people are finding it very difficult at the moment with the cost of living, and we understand that, and we get that, of course. But what I'd also say is £32,000, that is not a bad salary. That's more than I earned during a lot of my teaching career. The median salary is about $25,000 in Bassett Law, where I am, because it's well above the national average and so on. Of course, it's a lot more than a lot of staff in Parliament are paid as well. So whilst I'm sure that people want a decent wage, and I'm sure that every penny does count, I think we need to put it in context a bit. And really, nobody on 32,000 should be using food banks. Now, what I would say is there will be individual cases. People who've suffered domestic abuse, people who have had one-off costs or tragedies or various other things. And I think you have to treat them on their individual merits. But generally, a person on £32,000 a year, Patrick, should not be using a food bank.
Yeah, I mean, Paul, I'll bring you in now. Fireman and trade unionist Paul Embry. Firefighters might be good at putting out fires, but they're no good at managing their own finances, apparently.
Well, it's simply not true, and I think many firefighters would find it insulting, that suggestion. Look, the fact is, when you look at the average firefighter, after tax, national insurance, their occupational pension scheme contributions, they're taking home something like around £1,800 a month. Now, half of that immediately, roughly, on average, is wiped out through mortgage or rent payments. You've then got to factor in energy bills, which, as we know, are increasing sharply at the moment. You've then got to talk about food bills, which for the average family are something like £300 or £400 a month. You then talk about the standard monthly bills, such as water rates and council tax. You then talk about childcare. I mean, I don't know if Brendan's being serious when he says that firefighters should comfortably be able to get along on this salary. And it strikes me that perhaps he hasn't grasped just how serious this cost of living crisis is for people. People are really struggling to make ends meet. And of course, it's true that there are some people on a lower wage than firefighters. Some people are having it even tougher. But does that mean that firefighters themselves are not having it tough? Of course it doesn't. And the Tory MPs who are making this sort of case have got to get in the real world.
Brendan, you've got to get in the real world.
Yeah, I mean, you could point to people who are earning less, and you could look at pensioners, for example. And I'm not interested in a race to the bottom and saying I can live on less money than you can and so on. And I suppose we are assuming that is the sole breadwinner, and there's not another adult in the household, but then there's been government support. My wife and I, we've used things like 30 hours free childcare and tax-free childcare. Things like the energy bills, the £400 for that, extra if you need it, and so on. So there is that support that's there. But I think what we also have to bear in mind, for most of the country, this is a decent income. But now if you look on Twitter, and of course this caused quite a Twitter storm earlier, one word kept coming up quite often, and that word was London. And I think you have to look at London as a completely different case entirely. So cost of living crisis, yes, for many, but I think you also have a cost of London crisis, and that actually predates Ukraine, predates COVID. You could go back to saying that, Boris Johnson, I think in his first 5 years as London mayor, had doubled the number of affordable homes that he did. They're looking at this ultra low emissions zone now that's going to target people with old bangers and so on who can't afford a brand new electric Tesla. You can look at Labour and boroughs like Lambeth charging extra council tax to what used to be conservative ones like Westminster. So I think we have to look at London in isolation, but £32,000 I think is a good salary. I'd like a lot of my constituents to be earning that sort of salary. But for those who can't, then yes, it's great we have food banks and volunteers to help out.
Paul, I'm just going to throw over something that you said a bit earlier on about the pension contributions. I mean, presumably you could opt out the pension contributions, get that in your immediate pay packet. Should you not be doing that?
Well, I mean, of course you could opt out of having a pension scheme, being part of the pension scheme. But I don't think even the government would recommend that people opt out of their occupational pensions. This government, it's arguably one of the correct things it's done, is to argue that people should secure their own futures financially. So, I certainly don't want to see pensioner firefighters in destitution or poverty because they haven't entered into the pension scheme. That brings its own problems financially for the country in years to come. But look, Brendan says he doesn't want a race to the bottom, but every argument he made, more or less, was the race to the bottom. He's essentially saying, look, there are some people worse off than firefighters, including his constituents. So what are firefighters complaining about? Well, unquestionably, there are some people worse off, and it's right and proper that those people get decent wage increases as well. Because, look, the facts speak for themselves. Workers in this country, including firefighters, are in the grip of the tightest wage squeeze since Napoleonic times. They are being asked once again to take a real terms pay cut during a cost of living crisis when inflation is at something like 9 or 10%.
Paul,
people are really struggling to make ends meet. And lecturing people about budgeting better simply isn't the answer. You've got to give people decent pay rises, get money into people's pockets. That's how you alleviate people's problems.
That's it. Now, that Paul, I take on board exactly what you're saying, but that is a fine line. I'm going to throw it back to you, Brendan, because Paul might say lecturing people on budgeting better. I can remember when Chris Whitty used to lecture me and my family every single flipping evening, and I was sick of that. But actually, it was supposed to be government advice. Should we not have some government advice during a cost of living crisis? Are you not just giving out useful advice, Brendan? People like you and Lee Anderson.
Well, yeah, we've just done that with energy, about turning thermostats down and all sorts of things. But as I said before, Patrick, and a lot of my constituents would be delighted to earn £32,000 a year. That is an aspiration for a lot of people. And I think with food banks, I think it is completely wrong to trivialise food banks every time there's a wage negotiation there. And I would challenge the FBU to actually show me these people, certainly outside London, who are using food banks on £32,000 a year. Where are they?
Now, Brendan, to be fair, you raise an interesting point, and this is an uncomfortable issue. And Paul, I do have to put this to you, OK? We do hear a lot about these things just branded around. X and X is going to food banks. So-and-so is going to food banks. Paul, can you actually prove that firefighters are going to food banks? Paul? Is he there? We've lost Paul. Have we lost Paul?
I think it's
he's there. Sorry, Paul. Go on, can you prove it?
Crisis. Sorry, Patrick, say it again.
Sorry, Paul, I lost you there for a second, mate. Can you actually prove that firefighters are going to food banks?
Well, my union has reported that firefighters are. I'm perfectly happy to believe my union. I don't think my union is lying about that. And actually knowing firefighters, I've been a firefighter for 25 years, and firefighter colleagues are saying to me things now that they've never said to me before. They said to me before Christmas they were struggling to buy their kids Christmas presents. They were struggling to pay their energy bills. They were struggling to pay their mortgages. So I'm pretty certain that what the union has reported is true. But let me put this point, if I can, to Brendan. Why is it that Tory MPs always go for people at the lower end of the scale? What have we seen recently? We've seen city bonuses surging. We've seen executive pay going up handsomely. We've seen some of our corporations registering record profits. Now, why is it that the likes of Brendan and others don't say, well, actually, during a cost of living crisis, some of that sort of stuff is unethical. And if we're going to target people, we should perhaps target some of those people before we target emergency services who are struggling to make ends meet. That shows to me a pretty immoral set of priorities.
All right, Paul, thank you very much for that. I'll give the final word to Brendan, let him come back, and then we're off, chaps. Go on, Brendan.
Okay, thanks. I don't think £32,000 a year is the bottom end of the pile. I mean, that's not people on minimum wage. This is a skilled profession we're talking about here. I could go back 20 years. The FBU were asking for about 40-odd%, and I think the union leader had about an 80 grand odd package there. So, I mean, there's a long history of this. Now, I don't resent anybody going for a decent wage. Don't resent negotiations, Paul. I understand how unions work, and I completely respect that, and I respect firefighters. But £32,000 to visit a food bank, I think it's very much the exception rather than the rule.
Look, both of you, thank you very much. Done it in exactly the right way, and you love to see it, and I wish you both all the best. I'm sure I'll speak to you both very, very soon. That is MP Brendan Clark-Smith, Tory MP, and Fireman and Trade Unionist Paul Embry, just reacting to that story as to whether or not actually, realistically, £32,000 a year, you should be going to a food bank. I'm not sure. What do you think? Maybe you're on about that kind of money. Let us know. Get in touch. gbviews@gbnews.uk.